Life on the sea can often feel like time itself has slowed down. Ask any captain who has spent years on the water, and they'll tell you most days bring the same sights, the same endless horizon, and the same rhythmic sounds of waves against the hull. It can be monotonous, predictable, almost lulling, yet every so often the ocean hides a secret, waiting to surprise those who dare patrol its vastness. For the Sri Lankan Navy, such days usually passed in routine. Their duty was clear: to keep the waters safe. That meant scanning for smugglers, rescuing those in distress, and maintaining peace along the currents of the Indian Ocean. It was work that demanded alertness, but rarely offered shock. Until one day, about 10 miles from the coast, the routine broke into the extraordinary. It began with a peculiar sight. From a distance, the naval crew spotted something bobbing in the deep, dark water. At first, they thought it was debris, perhaps wood fallen from a fishing vessel, or cargo lost overboard. The waters in that area were cold, rough, and not a place where one expected to find anything alive. But as they drew nearer, confusion turned into disbelief. There, rising and falling with the waves, was not a whale, not a shark, not even a massive fish. It was something no one had ever expected to see at sea: an elephant. For a moment, the crew stood frozen, staring, as if their eyes were playing tricks on them. Elephants belong to the land, to jungles and forests, not the middle of the ocean. Yet here was one, its massive head pushing through the water, its trunk lifting above the waves like a snorkel. The men couldn't believe it. Whales, yes. Sharks, of course. But an elephant drifting so far from shore? Never. And yet, the impossible was right before them. Theories came quickly. Perhaps the animal had been trying to cross a lagoon or river and was caught in a powerful current. The rushing waters could have carried it further and further until the coastline disappeared behind it. Elephants, after all, are surprisingly good swimmers. Their buoyant bodies allow them to float, and their long trunks work like natural snorkels, letting them breathe while their bodies remain submerged. Still, even the strongest swimmer has limits. And this elephant, soon nicknamed Jumbo by the crew, was clearly reaching his. His movements were slow, labored. His eyes blinked heavily as waves splashed against his face. Each time his trunk lifted, it was a desperate gasp for air. The crew realized he had been out there for hours, maybe longer, and exhaustion was written across every struggling motion. The men exchanged worried glances. An elephant that size, stranded in the middle of the ocean, was a tragedy in the making, unless someone acted fast. But what could they do? Their ship was sturdy, but it wasn't built to haul an animal of such enormous weight. Jumbo was far too heavy to be pulled aboard. They knew that saving him would require more than one vessel, and more than just sailors. The decision came swiftly. They called for reinforcements, additional Navy ships, and the country's wildlife department. This was no ordinary rescue. It was a mission that demanded both manpower and expertise. As they waited, the sailors did what they could. They circled around Jumbo, keeping their presence close enough to reassure him, but far enough not to frighten him further. They watched his weary trunk dip in and out of the waves, and knew that time was running short. If they didn't act soon, he would not survive. At last, another ship arrived, followed by wildlife experts who climbed aboard, their faces etched with determination. Plans were drawn quickly, voices low but firm. Pulling Jumbo out of the water was impossible, but towing him back to shore? That just might work. It wouldn't be easy. By this time, the elephant had drifted even farther from land, carried deeper into the Indian Ocean. He was no longer 10 miles offshore, but far beyond. The rescue would take hours, perhaps the whole day, moving slowly enough not to injure him, but steadily enough to reach the shallow lagoons before nightfall. The men knew what they were up against: an exhausted animal, the sheer distance to cover, and the unpredictable mood of the sea. But none of that stopped them. With ropes and careful maneuvering, they secured Jumbo to their vessels and began the long tow back toward safety. All around them, the ocean stretched vast and unending. Jumbo's weary eyes blinked at the men who guided him, his trunk lifting occasionally to draw breath. His massive frame floated behind the ships like a drifting island, vulnerable yet resilient. As the hours passed, the rescuers pushed forward, knowing every mile brought the trust. Elephant closer to life or closer to death. Night was falling, shadows lengthening across the waves, but they would not stop. Not while Jumbo's fate still hung in the balance. The men's hands tightened on the ropes, their eyes fixed on the horizon. And as darkness settled over the Indian Ocean, they whispered silent prayers that their strength would outlast the sea's indifference. Because somewhere deep in those waters, a creature of land was fighting his last battle against the tide, and only human determination could bring him home again. The sea can be merciless, and as the hours dragged on, the rescue began to feel like an endless test of endurance. The ropes strained with every pull, the ships moving slowly but steadily, towing the massive animal through the open ocean. Jumbo's trunk rose from the water now and then, taking in air with audible effort. Each breath seemed heavier than the last, and the men watching knew he was nearing his limits. The crew took shifts, adjusting the ropes, making sure the elephant wasn't dragged too quickly or submerged under the waves. Their focus was sharp, their movements careful, for one wrong pull could cause the exhausted animal to panic or slip beneath the surface. From time to time, Jumbo let out a deep rumble, almost like a groan, echoing across the water. It reminded everyone on board that this was not just a mission, it was a race against time. By nightfall, fatigue spread through the rescuers as well. Their arms ached, their eyes stung from salt and sweat, yet not one of them considered giving up. The Indian Ocean was vast and uncaring, but they refused to let it claim Jumbo. The wildlife experts encouraged them, reminding the sailors that elephants were survivors by nature. As long as he can keep his trunk above water, one expert said, he has hope. The rescue continued under the pale light of the moon, the ships creating shimmering trails on the dark surface. Hours passed, until at last, the water beneath them began to shift. The color changed. The waves softened, the unmistakable sign of approaching shallow. The men cheered quietly, relief flooding through their voices. Land was still distant, but the lagoon waters were within reach. As they drew closer, Jumbo seemed to sense the change. His movements grew a little stronger, his trunk rising with more energy than before. Perhaps he smelled the familiar scent of land, or perhaps instinct whispered that safety was near. Whatever it was, he pushed on, matching the rhythm of the ships that guided him. Finally, after a grueling day and night, they reached the edge of the lagoon. The depth had lessened enough for Jumbo's enormous feet to brush the sandy floor. At first, he stumbled, unsteady after so long afloat, but then he planted himself firmly, holding his massive weight with newfound strength. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the elephant began to walk, step by heavy step, toward the shallow waters. The sailors released the ropes, watching in silence as the creature moved on his own. With each step, the water grew lower against his body, until, at last, Jumbo stood tall and free, the sea no longer his prison. His ears flapped gently, his trunk lifted into the air, and for a moment it was as if he saluted the men who had refused to abandon him. Exhaustion overcame him quickly after that. The rescuers knew that once he found dry ground, he would collapse into much-needed rest. But he was safe, that was what mattered. Later, members of the naval team reflected on what had happened. They admitted it was pure chance that they had been patrolling that part of the ocean that day. Their routes often changed, carrying them to different corners of the Indian Ocean. Had fate placed them elsewhere, Jumbo's story might have ended very differently. It was, as one officer put it, a case of being in the right place at the right time. For the people of Sri Lanka, the tale became one of pride, a testament to courage, compassion, and the bond between humans and animals. Few would ever forget the sight of an elephant drifting far out at sea, and fewer still would forget the men who brought him home. As dawn broke over the lagoon the next morning, the waves were calm again, as though the ocean itself had erased the struggle of the day before. But for those who witnessed it, the memory remained, a reminder that sometimes the strangest, most extraordinary battles happen where you least expect them. And so, Jumbo lived saved by the hands of sailors who chose not to turn away, but to fight the sea itself for his life.